Oh, is this the resident the Parento is? I work for the federal government and was sent here to remove Lana Parento from your custody.
How would you feel if that was you, whether you were the kid, parent, or even if that was just your neighbor? Would you feel sick, disgusted, mad, angry, in shock? Today I'd like to speak about the 60s scoop, the tragedies and stories involved. I'm Lucas Scott, and recently I've been looking into the 60s scoop. Today I'm joined by some experts on the topic, Kieran Arnold, Zach King, and Phoenix DeRose. Kieran, I know you're quite the expert on history, so could you start us off with some background information on the 60s scoop?
Well, I'm glad you asked. The process began in 1951 when changes to the Indian Act were made giving the provinces jurisdiction over Indigenous children. By the 1960s, after living under harsh federal policies such as the Indian Act and going through the hardships of residential schools, many Indigenous communities, especially reserves, were widespread with poverty, high death rates, and socio-economic barriers. This resulted in a reason for welfare agencies to take children from thousands of Indigenous homes rather than seeing the common issue and providing support to a large category of people financially or helping these families get into a better situation.
So, who all did this involve? Zach, you got anything for us?
Well, Lucas, it does involve a large group of people.
Well, let's cut to the chase. Let's hear it.
Welfare agencies around Canada were given permission from the government to scoop up children from their families and put them into foster care. From foster care, they were then advertised and adopted often by middle-class, non-Indigenous families. So it mainly involved Indigenous families, mainly on reserves, but not limited to, the government, welfare agencies, and families looking to adopt.
So, what exactly is the 60s scoop? How long did it occur for?
The 60s scoop lasted all the way from the late 1950s to the early 1980s. Although it was primarily seen through the 1960s, it became legal to take Indigenous children in 1951, and the government began implicating and promoting it as they thought it was the easiest way to solve Indigenous welfare issues.
So basically, the 60s scoop refers to the large tragedy that occurred in the 60s, which involved the removal or scooping of Indigenous children away from their families of birth by the government. This would result in children getting adopted by predominantly non-Indigenous families, meaning the child would lose all their sense of culture identity. I really don't get how this was allowed for so long. Didn't you say it lasted from the 1960s all the way to the 1980s? How come it never stopped?
That's the issue. It was all government ran, and despite people speaking against it, there was nothing anyone could do. Legally speaking, it was allowed. However, even the police couldn't do anything but enforce it, even though it was morally wrong.
Lucas, I think we've said enough big words and history for the people. Let's get into the real life story.
Ah, yes. Great idea. Sorry, sometimes I just get carried away with all these questions. What was the story we had planned out for today?
It's the story of Lana Parento, a powerful Native woman who experienced this whole tragedy firsthand.
Kieran, why don't you give us a little background to what her story is?
Lana was 5 years old at the time she was taken from her home. She lived in Moraviantown, Ontario, with her biological family before she was taken.
Lana had 6 older brothers, a younger brother and sister, and also another sister, but is unknown where she is because she was adopted at birth.
Lana says she remembers her older brothers, but does not remember anyone younger than her. Lana says she slowly started to lose her culture and self-identity, and she didn't even know who she was.
When Lana was 15 years old, she found out she was able to visit her biological family. It was when she was 18, she ran away from her adoptive family. Lana called her adoptive family and one of Lana's brother's phone number. She called, and that's when she was able to start coming home.
Lana said she had been going back and forth to her family. She finally started to meet her biological mother, father, and all of her siblings. Once Lana was settled in at home, she says she has no reason to talk to her adopted family.
I believe they thought they were doing the right thing, but didn't know they took all this from me.
These were words said by Lana. She says they took her culture and her family. Since then, Lana has been going to ceremonies and does traditional healing.
But after all these years, why did Lana just now decide to speak about what happened?
She says so others don't have to feel like they're alone.
If Lana is with her biological family, why does she still feel alone?
Lana said when her and other Indigenous children were adopted, they all felt alone. They had zero support from anyone, and they blamed the fact they got adopted on themselves.
I think that the more Lana and other children speak up about their stories and what happened to them, we can help spread awareness and help these Indigenous people be heard.
What legal actions were taken once Lana was home? Was there compensation?
Lana said there was a class action suit held in Toronto.
Don't forget, Lana never wanted money because of what happened. She just doesn't want to see something like this happen again.
Too many children suffered from things such as physical abuse and sexual abuse. These children were workhorses.
Indigenous people need healing and forgiveness, not only for others, but for themselves. It's hard to move on when there are people who still don't know where they're from.
Lana says she just wants people to understand that they are here.
Honestly, this whole story is heartbreaking. I can't believe that this whole thing occurred. I couldn't even imagine being taken away from my own family. You know, Kieran, back in grade 6, I was at school and I got taken off my gym dodgeball team because I hadn't handed in my spelling homework, and I was devastated. Imagine leaving your own family, not even just a team, and they had no actual reason behind that.
You know, Lucas, you could have just done your spelling homework.
Touchy subject, Kieran. Touchy subject. There's no need to bring that one up.
Let's get back to the story here, guys. No more dodgeball talk. Besides, Lucas, we both know you and Kieran would get smoked by me in a dodgeball fight.
Let's not go that far. I was a pretty mean dodgeball player.
Anyways, back to the story. Lana had to fight her own battle to get reunited with her family, and all I had to do was hand in my darn spelling homework.
That's right, Lucas. That's all you had to do, and yet you still couldn't.
You're right. So what's being done now that the 60s scoop is over? Is there any programs or further research to help survivors recover? Because I'd sure hope there is.
Yeah, there actually has been a lot of efforts out forwards to create 60 Scoop survivor organizations, charities, and programs. Examples of these programs include places for Indigenous people to go work on their mental health, as well as foundations such as the 60 Scoop Healing Foundation, which was able to receive federal settlement money through a lawsuit to divide amongst people affected.
I just can't believe that people can just act like nothing happened. The more we talk about this, the more I realize how truly messed up this whole situation really was.
I totally agree with Zach here. I don't know how the government ever thought it was ethical or right to ever do this. So guys, what can people like us do to help support the 60 Scoop ancestors?
The best thing everyday people like you and me can do is to become educated on things such as the 60s scoop and spread awareness so tragic events like this never happen again.
There's also several charities you can find online that are still working towards saving Indigenous people and communities who are still struggling from the fallouts of the 60 Scoop and residential schools. And those communities and people could benefit from any possible donations, whether it be $1 or $100.
Well, that's good to hear, that efforts are still being made to make up for the wrongs that our people committed just 60 years ago.
I'd like to ask one more topic to do with the 60 Scoop.
Go ahead.
Well, I'd just like to know how it was stopped and why people didn't see how wrong it was for so long.
That's a good question, Phoenix. It was actually stopped by the Ontario Police Force when Ontario chiefs spoke up about how wrong it was. Although this wasn't for close to 20 years, they finally realized what was wrong.
Yeah, basically the government was saying that they were only taking children away from families who weren't suitable to sustain a child they were taking. But in reality, not only was it the government's fault these families were in poverty due to harsh federal laws and residential schools, but many families were completely suitable for a child to live in.
Honestly, I think that's just surreal to think the government would do such a thing. The people who are supposed to protect our rights were doing quite the opposite not too long ago.
Guys, I just want to know, how do you think government should have approached Indigenous poverty on reserves and in Indigenous communities?
Well, first off, residential schools should have never happened or as harsh of federal laws.
I believe they should have worked on rebuilding and funding reserves in impoverished Indigenous communities rather than trying to tear them apart by taking the new generations. I think that would have been a key to revitalize reserves all around Canada, and it could have started a relationship between the government and Indigenous people. But of course, there'd have to have been no residential schools either.
Yeah, well, residential schools is a topic for a whole new day.
Well, I think today was a great talk about Lana Parenteau and the stories of the 60s scoop. I just hope our listeners can understand the true struggles these people went through and how tough it must have been for them.
I just want to thank everyone for tuning in to our podcast today, and I hope you enjoyed it. I'm Phoenix.
I'm Zach.
I'm Kieran.
And I'm Lucas. Have a good one. Here are some bloopers from recording. Honestly, this whole story is heartbreaking. I can't believe that this whole thing occurred. I couldn't even be... No, I do, trust. Oh, shit.
I'm glad you asked. The process began in 1951 when changes...
Bad word.
It was when she was...
And that's the end of our podcast.